Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class. It's for Sunday, August the 2nd. This is the last of our 13-week class for the book of Second Kings. We appreciate you being a part of that as well. We're going to begin where we left off last week, Second Kings chapter 23, verse 31. Our writer, for the most part, just flies over these 23 years, but he does give us some kings and dates and sieges so that we can follow the story in a good way. I want to give you an overview of the last four kings of Judah. In 23, verse 31, Jehoahaz. This was about 609 BC, and he uh, serves only as king for 3 months because Pharaoh, who's over Egypt, is over Judah, carries him off into Egypt, and there he dies. And then in verse 36 of chapter 23, Pharaoh names Jehoiakim as the new king. Now, Jehoiakim is it has his name changed from Eliakim, who is another son of Josiah. And he reigns 11 years, from 609 to 598 BC. And during his reign, there was a power struggle between Egypt and Babylon wins out. And after a while, Jehoiakim dies, and his son Jehoiachin takes his place as king. But he lasts only 3 months. And the reason for that is in 2 Kings chapter 24, beginning with verse 10, he surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar because Jerusalem was under siege. They take him as prisoner. They also take all of his family, some of his fighting men, all of his officials, and 10,000 citizens of Jerusalem go into exile. And then Pharaoh names a new king. His name is Zedekiah. Sorry, this is Nebuchadnezzar. And he names Zedekiah as the new king. This is in verse 18 of chapter 24. He changes his name from Mathaniah, who is an uncle of Jehoiachin, and he is given the name Zedekiah. And he rules for 11 years, 597 to 587. In chapter 24, verse 20, we see Zedekiah rebels. And then in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 25, Babylon seizes Jerusalem. And for 2 years, that siege is underway. And finally, Jerusalem falls. This is in chapter 25, verses 3 through 10, about 587 BC. And the portion, number 3, takes place in verses 11 and 12. That would have been 586 BC. The writer is telling us that Judah is history. When you read about these four kings in the verses that we made reference to at the beginning of the lesson, we see one phrase that is used for all four kings. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In chapter 23, 32, that's Jehoahaz. In verse 37, Jehoiakim. And then in chapter 24, verse 9, Jehoiachin. And then in chapter 24, verse 19, Zedekiah. None of these four kings had the trembling faith of Hezekiah or the exciting obedience of Josiah. These four kings simply did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It takes holiness. It takes godliness to be a good king of Judah like Hezekiah or Josiah were. As you look at chapter 24, we see Judah has a doomed history. Judah was past hope. Now, it was a faithful doom because the word of the Lord said it was going to happen. So the Lord is a faithful God even when he must bring destruction. In chapter 24, verse 2, the Lord sent out multiple raiders against Judah, which was the beginning of their destruction. Then chapter 24, verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar cleans out the temple and the palaces of their treasures. In chapter 24, we're seeing an irreversible doom. Let me read verses 3 and 4. Surely the mouth of the Lord had happened in Judah to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and also because of the innocent blood he shed. So that he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord did not want to forgive. The NIV says the Lord was unwilling to forgive. The Lord had determined he was not going to forgive. What can be more frightful than knowing that forgiveness was not an option? So Judah is doomed in their history. And of course, we're not surprised at that. Not only do they have a doomed history, they have a sad history. In both chapters 24 and 25, we see that. First, in chapter 24, beginning with verse 8, there's a gloom that the writer wants us to feel because Jehoiachin, just resigned. He was king just long enough to surrender Jerusalem over to Nebuchadnezzar. This was in 597 BC. Verse 14 says that Nebuchadnezzar led all of Jerusalem into exile. And the verse 14 also says the number was 10,000 citizens of Jerusalem. Then verse 15, he exiled Jehoiachin to Babylon. And then the end of verse 15, he says the king's family, many of his fighting men and his officials also were exiled to Jerusalem. So the sadness of 597 BC is exile. The cream of the crop of Judah is being carted off to Babylon. Second, the sad history continues in chapter 25, beginning with verse 8. After the Babylonians broke down the walls of the city of Jerusalem, King Zedekiah fled, and they went and they captured him. And Nebuchadnezzar carried him to Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar also looks over and supervises the demolition of the city of Jerusalem. They burned down the temple. They burned down the palaces. And they burned down all the important residences. And then they pulled down the walls of Jerusalem. This is chapter 25, verses 9 and 10. So the sadness, though, is that there's the destruction of the temple. That means all of their valuable things of religious nature, a connection to God, is lost. Not only is there a doomed history and a sad history, but I call chapter 24 showing us a stupid history. In 24 verse 1, we see Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And whenever that happened, he kind of turned to Egypt to come back and give him some help. But they could not help Jehoiakim. And then in verse 20, we see King Zedekiah in 587 BC also was in rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, and he also looked to Egypt, and Egypt could not help him either. In the end, the Babylonians put a stranglehold on the city of Jerusalem and all of Judah. And then in chapter 25, verses 22 and 26, the stupid history continues. There is, after the capture of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, a provisional government is set up for the territory that's been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and it's under the governorship of Gedaliah. In verses 22 through 24 of chapter 25, you get the feeling that things have about turned back to where there's some sanity in Judah. But then in 25, verse 25, Ishmael, son of Nathaniah, and his executioners come to Mizpah, and there they butchered Gedaliah, all the Jews, and all the Babylons that are in that city. More of this story can be read in the book of Isaiah, chapters 40 and 41. So we have Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, and Ishmael, whom I call the three stooges of Israel of Judah. At the end of this section of chapter 25 and of the book of 2 Kings, we have Jehoiachin, now a senior citizen in captivity in the nation of Babylon. He's been there all these years, but he's being given some sort of freedom there in captivity in Babylon. So there is beginning to see a future that could be tolerable for the nation of Judah that's been captured. The Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk, in 562 became king. His very first year as king over Babylon, he gives a partial release to Jehoiachin. This is in verse 27. In verse 28, he spoke good things with Jehoiachin. And in verse 28, the last part, Jehoiachin was elevated to a new position. And then in verses 29 and 30, the chapter ends highlighting that Jehoiachin receives other privileges and provisions. Not only is he allowed to eat at the king's table every day, but also his whole family receives regular food allowances. So there is some hope that is seen for the nation that has this Davidic exile king receiving blessings from Babylon. So the people of God should begin to see a little hope. We've seen here in 2 Kings for Judah, the end has come. In chapter 23, verses 29 through 33, they lost their independence. Jehoahaz, as we talked a moment ago, was on the throne only 3 months. And then Pharaoh takes him into captivity, and he enthroned Eliakim, another son of Josiah, king, changing his name to Zedekiah. And Pharaoh imposes a tribute on Judah. And Eliakim, or Zedekiah, places the tax on the people to pay the tribute. And then in verses 34 of chapter 23 through verse 7 of chapter 24, they lost their land. The power struggle between Egypt and Babylon takes place, and Babylon takes control over Judah. About 593 BC, Jehoiakim rebels. And so Nebuchadnezzar begins to send his vassal state rebels in to ravish the people of Judah. And this is kind of the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. And then the real siege begins with Nebuchadnezzar coming with his army. And Jehoiachin turns the city over to Nebuchadnezzar and all the people. And he gives himself over as a prisoner. So his 3-month reign ends. Not only did they lose their independence and their land, but in chapter 24, beginning with verse 8, they lose their wealth and their leading people. Nebuchadnezzar took 10,000, including officials and fighting men and all the important people of Jerusalem, into captivity, 10,000. And Nebuchadnezzar then took all the treasures from the royal palaces and also from the temple there in Jerusalem. Not only did they lose their wealth and their leading people, their land and their independence, but in chapter 24, verse 18 through the end of the chapter, they lost their city, their temple, and their hope. Nebuchadnezzar made Mattaniah king. He's Jehoiachin's uncle, and he becomes king in Jerusalem. They change his name to Zedekiah. He ruled for 11 years. He not only did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, but he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon brings a siege against Jerusalem. That lasts for 2 years, and Zedekiah then flees, and he's caught. He's taken to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar comes, and he burns the palaces, the temple, and the great houses of Jerusalem. And he takes more people then off into exile, and that would have been 586 BC. Through our study of 2 Kings, we keep coming back to the covenant promises that God made to the nation of Israel. Very simple. He says, you keep my commands, and I'm going to bless you. You turn from me and you sin in other ways, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to send you into exile. But if you humbly turn back and repent and worship me, I will forgive you. However, eventually, their sins became so great, they could not be pushed aside anymore. Today, you and I are under a new covenant. That was prophesied by Jeremiah in chapter 31, verse 31 and following. Then we see the fulfillment of that in the book of New Testament book of Hebrews, beginning with chapter 8. You know, because God is the same God, we can learn the mistakes, the errors of the people of Israel. But if we will do what God asked them to do, follow him, he will bless us. But if we do like they did and turn from him, he will curse us. He will punish us. But if we do sin, we must humbly return to him, and he will forgive and bless us. Let me read to you a few verses from the Hebrew passage that talks about this fulfillment of the prophecy that Jeremiah gave us. In chapter 8, verse 6, this ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator superior to the old one. And it is founded on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. Then the end of chapter 8, by calling this covenant new, he made the first one obsolete. And the thought continues on down into the end of chapter 9, beginning with verse 26. Now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting on him. Aren't you glad that you're waiting on him? We have a promise from God that will never fail. Thank you for joining us again with the study of 2 Kings.